me going this morning? Outstanding, outstanding. I'm Gunner Sergeant Reagan. I am a monitor of the United States Marine. Myself, my fellow interpreters, and active duty Marines are about ready to tell you a story. As I stand here before you, as my other Marines are, we are effigies of those Marines that stood here on this very ground 158 years ago. Before we get started, I want to advise you as an audience, we're going to make you work for a living. Like that, every one of you, in some part, is going to take part of the program, or at least what we're going to say is going to make you work. I'm going to make you use the tools that I'm sure every one of you have. Most of you have started to learn the monocle of how to use that tool. And no, I'm not talking about your iPhone. Anybody know what I'm talking about? That brain housing group sitting on top of your shoulder. We're going to make you think. Most of you have read history about John Brown's raid and like that, and probably have formed a basic opinion of what you think happened here and who was right and who was wrong. But now I'm going to plant a seed of what I want you to think about as we go along. First of all, you're all come here to learn about history, this beautiful historic site, right? What is history? Everybody know? Young man, you know what history is? Stuff that happened in the past. Are we making history right now? Absolutely. History is linear and ongoing. It never stops. And history does not happen in a vacuum. There's things happening all over the world at the same time. Now, why is history important? Now, we look, for example, like this. Look at this building behind us. You know, John Brown actually used that building, ended up becoming part of his raid. You see the muskets and uniforms we're wearing and stuff like that. Did they make history? No, they didn't. I'd like you to go up to that building and answer the question and see if it answers. They're inanimate objects, which leads me back to the question. And I'll make it easier. Who makes history? We do. We all do. We are making history right now. And 158 years ago, people made the history. Their sacrifices, their achievements, and their decisions, like that, would influence who we are as a society today. So what we're going to be presenting to you today, like that, is several aspects of that. That leads you to the last part, like that. We talk about history. And I like to tell people there's actually two levels of history. One we always look at in the history book and such is what we refer to as historical fact. What is historical fact? It's something that we can all agree on that happened in the past, no matter how far back. We know that building was used. We know that Robert E. Lee, John Brown, and other noted people were involved in the John Brown raid. But that also leads to the other side of the coin that many of us often have a tendency to ignore, like that, or overlook. What I usually refer to as historical truth. What is historical truth? Simplified, your individual point of view. Brought back 158 years. Imagine you were a reporter at the time and you're interviewing one of the Marines out here in Harpers Ferry. You get a story from that person's perspective. Then you talk to one of the citizens that were here, possibly one that had a family member killed or held hostage. You get a separate point of view there. And more importantly, then you turn around and interview one of the insurrectionists, even John Brown himself, and you get an entirely different point of view there. Who's right? Who's wrong? Who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? I'm not going to try to tell you opinion, but what we will try to do is show all of those basic points of view, and you decide, like that, of what you think was right and wrong. And was there any bad guys or good guys here, or just some people that made the wrong decisions for the right reason? To start a program, as we move forward, keeping that in mind, I'm going to turn you over to a gentleman that's going to be representing one of the prominent citizens in Harpers Ferry. Because the Marines didn't take part right away. We were actually latecomers in the operation. Like I say, it was citizens like yourselves that, believe it or not, were the principal people that resolved it. It was only at the late end of the game that professional soldiers like the Marines were brought in to resolve the situation.
I represent Lewis Washington. I was the great-grandnephew of George Washington himself. On the night of October 17th, I was about to go in my bed when I heard a loud banging at my door. I went down to answer it. I met John Cook, a man who had lived in this town for at least a year, married one of our girls here, had been entertained in my house several times. This time, though, he was holding a gun. And he had several other men with him, some of them laughed. And they were holding guns as well. And I was now informed that I was a hostage, and I was being taken prisoner. They allowed me to get decent into my clothes. They took me out and several of my slaves put us in a wagon and took us down the hill to my neighbor John Allstat, where they immediately took him hostage and some of his people as well. And several more on the way here. We traveled the 5 miles here to Harpers Ferry, where they turned us loose in the armory grounds with other men who had come to work and been taken prisoner as well. And there I began to put together what was going on. In fact, the leader of this gang was even now wearing a sword that belonged to me, and it belonged to my great uncle. Here he is wearing it around and strutting it around, and he told me who he was. He was John Brown. But I had been introduced to him before as Isaac Smith, as he came here to live. And he told me of this great plan he had where he was going to come here, take these weapons out of the armory, and arm the slaves and create a slave insurrection that would sweep down from the mountains down through the south and get rid of slavery forever. Now I found out how this came to be. It turned out that he had a farm over here, Kennedy Farm, he was renting at the time, and he had gathered together at least 22 men. And on the night of October 17th, they crossed over the railroad bridge, overpowered the watchmen here at the armory, and began searching for weapons in the armory grounds. But they were out of luck there because rumors of a impending flood had caused the armory workers to move all assembled weapons all the way up to the far end of the line in another place to keep them safe from water. However, he did send a group of his men down to Virginia's Island, where the Hall Rifle Works was located, and there they were successful. They picked up Hall rifles and loaded up their wagon and took the wagon back over to the Maryland side. And those few raiders that were in that wagon would survive. And now, another thing happened they weren't counting on. About 1 o'clock in the morning, a train came to town and they stopped it. Probably the biggest mistake they ever made. They stopped the train, held it up for a while, and then allowed the train to proceed. While the train was sitting there, the night porter, by the name of Hayward Shepard, a free black man, came to see why the train was there, figuring he must need his services. He couldn't find the watchman because he was a prisoner, and instead he ran into a raider who confronted him with a gun and told him to halt. And in a panic, he turned to run away, and when he did, he was shot in the back. He suffered a mortal wound. That gunshot also woke up a local doctor in town by the name of John Starry. Starry came down and attended to Shepard, realized the man couldn't live. As a matter of fact, the man would die the next morning at 3 o'clock in the afternoon after suffering all night long. And for reasons unknown, Brown and his raiders allowed Dr. Starry to go on his own. And Starry immediately saddled his horse and became the Paul Revere of Harpers Ferry, because he soon got on that horse and went around everywhere he could and alerted all the local militias. And of course the militias then began to assemble to take care of this threat to their town. And of course all militias had a central meeting place where they would go to get together. Probably the most famous part of American history in those days, because this was the #1 meeting place for everybody to get together, to find out the news, to know what was going on. And that was the tavern. There you go. And of course those men who got there early had to do something while they're waiting. And the proprietor certainly wasn't going to lose any money, and so they bent the elbow. And by the time the militias were fully assembled to come here, several of the men were in pretty bad straits. But on they came anyway. The militia were very bold in that. Now while they were assembling the militia, some of the townsfolk also responded, and a few of them paid with their lives. And some of the raiders were now cut down as well. So the shooting was now breaking out in the streets. Now the militia came and they went across the Shenandoah and blocked it there to get hold of the raiders that were at Virginia's Island. And another group of militia crossed the Potomac up north here, came down the Maryland side, and came over the railroad bridge and attacked the town here. So there was a tremendous gunfight going on back and forth between the militia and these raiders. As it turned out, the leader, John Brown, gathered up myself and a few others, put us into the engine house. He put up to 30 people in the watchman's shed over here, and he had 11 of us in this part over here with some of our slaves. And they were holed up in there, and they were basically surrounded by the militia, as you can see happening right now. And sporadic shooting was taking place back and forth. Now, at one point, the leader decided he needed to try to make some kind of truce with these people to see if they could get out of there in some way. And he sent out his two sons under a flag of truce. And when they came out of the engine house, the militia was so obsessed with getting rid of them that they fired on them anyway, put them down.
Red.
So there was no hope then of making any kind of deal with the local militia. Now, pot shots took place the rest of the afternoon. In fact, at one point, the mayor of the town, Fontaine Beckham, came down to see what was going on, stuck his head around the corner to take a look, and when he did, he paid with his life. One of the raiders shot him through the heart. By a sense of irony, one time Fontaine Beckham had owned Hayward Shepherd and had freed the man, and now the two men lay side by side ready for the mortician. As it was, the militia would stay here throughout the afternoon, and during the night, the Frederick City militia from Maryland would also come across the bridge, and they would come over to assist the Virginia militia. Now, while all this was going on, that train had gone out of the town. As soon as they hit a town that had a working telegraph, they had started sending messages out. And now the word was getting out and all the way to Washington, D.C., and it was time for federal troops to try to get involved. But meanwhile, the militia here is holding their own. They've got these raiders trapped in the engine house, only about 7 of them at this point, of which 2 are in bad shape. But they wondered, where were the federal troops? Didn't anybody notify Washington? Wasn't there going to be any help at all from the U.S. government? We'll find out.
As always throughout history, nothing happens in a vacuum. While this was perpetuated here at Harpers Ferry, the word is starting to radiate out, especially to the federal government. Now, initially, this being in the state of Virginia, it was a local issue, and like that. But as word worked its way back up to Washington, D.C. by train, by telegraph, and ultimately word of mouth, like that, by midday of the 17th of October, like that, President Buchanan finally got word that there's a major insurrection taking place at Harpers Ferry. And as even today, despite the modern communication we have, the same thing would apply then. What started out with Brown and 21 raiders, the time the first word of mouth got, it was up to 150 raiders. The time it got to the president's office, there's hundreds of raiders. They possibly have artillery. Slaves are rising up to support him and such. It was a major conflagration. Nothing has changed in 158 years like that. But this left the president in a very bad quandary. And politics would start to coming very heavily into here. Not only the strategic and tactical situation, we now had to look at the political situation. President Buchanan looked at the idea, okay, this is a state issue. I like that. Normally, they would not have federal government troops unless directly requested intervene. But at this point, because there was a federal arsenal involved, he would send federal troops. But the reality of it is the militia was still our dominant military force in this country like that. The United States Army in 1859, the entire United States Army numbered 16,000 men, less than 16,000 men. And most of those are on the Western Territories. The Marine Corps at that time, we had less than 1,500 men. And most of those were at sea in ships. A few at Navy yards and such. And like saying, that left Buchanan with basically in the quandary of like that, who do I send in the way of federal troops? First of all, he needed somebody to act as a liaison, a negotiator between the local militia officers and any federal assets that may be sent down. So a young lieutenant colonel that by chance was on leave at his home in Arlington, basically clearing up the estate of his father-in-law at Arlington, Virginia. A young officer named Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee was the only senior federal officer available. At the same time, I like that a young lieutenant named J.E.V. Stewart was sitting in the War Department. As the word was passed down to the Secretary of War from the President, I need all available federal troops to be sent to Harpers Ferry. The word first went out to the Army at Fort Monroe, Virginia. The downside is they were well over 2 days away, transported both by barge and rail before they could even think about getting to Harpers Ferry. The Secretary of War says, no, wait, say, we don't have anybody other than on the Army side of the house, the United States Marines. So begrudgingly, the Secretary of War, inter-service rivalry was still a big thing even then. Secretary of War goes to Secretary of Navy, says, do you have Marines available? And of course, Secretary of Navy says, yes, we have the garrison at Marine Barracks in Washington that can be sent. Intermittently, like that, as I said, Jeb Stewart was sitting there listening to this conversation. And like as the Secretary of War was offering to send his aide to go get Lee, Stewart said, oh, like say, I'll volunteer to go get Lieutenant Colonel Lee. And like that. He was a young, hard-charging officer. He smelled action. He wanted in on it. So he would then eventually go and, like say, notify Lee, come back, and then volunteer to come to Harpers Ferry as his aide. Now here we got a situation, but at the same time, the word goes to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Commandant Harris, and like that, we need all available Marines. The officer of the day at that time was a young lieutenant of 12 years experience, the United States Marine Corps, named Israel Green. I like that. There was only 3 officers in the barracks at that time. One was sick, one would have to stay back. So he would be the sole officer, line officer that we assigned. He would muster the orderly sergeant of the commandant, based on the sergeant major of the Marine Corps at that time, a second orderly sergeant of the company, and a total of 86 enlisted Marines and like that would be mustered and prepared to board trains. Like that. At the same time, they would take 2 howitzers. Again, they had no idea what to expect. They were planning for a severe fight. They immediately organized march to train. In fact, they left in such a hurry that Lieutenant Green, like that, being the officer of the day, typical of the period, and even today, instead of wearing his combat sword, but they were functional weapons at that time, because he was in garrison and on standing officer of the day, he was wearing his ceremonial sword. That's what he would leave and go to Harpers Ferry with, and would actually play a very significant part of what eventually would happen. Now, the Commandant of the Marine Corps was also looking at the idea, as well as the Secretary of the Navy, because of the political issues here, we can't merely send a young lieutenant, and his sole networking is going to be with an Army lieutenant colonel he's never worked with before. We need a liaison between the Marine Corps and the Army. So the paymaster, like that, Major Russell, who at that time by law could not command troops, he was a staff officer, like that, was then assigned to go along, like say, with the Marines, and he would be the liaison between Lieutenant Colonel Lee and Lieutenant Green. Like say, Orderly Sergeant McDonough, the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, essentially like that. We surmise, as modern Marines, that the biggest purpose he was sent along and like that's walk behind with his hand on Lieutenant Green's collar. Okay, sir, back off a little bit. Let's think about this. So like that, we don't like say Green was going to go with the attitude. Let's kill them all. Let God sort them out. That situation. So basically, this was the contingency. Marines were in a hurry to get there. They smelled action. They've been standing nothing but garrison. They were professional soldiers. Their life was very tedious. Like that, they went to D.C. They boarded the train like that, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we're on their way to Harpers Ferry. Well, unfortunately, Lieutenant Colonel Lee and Lieutenant Stewart were still being briefed by the President. The Marines left them. They weren't waiting for anybody. They were gone. And like that, so they ended up rushing up a special train. The Marines had to go to Baltimore, change trains to come down to Harpers Ferry. And at that time, we didn't have standardized track systems like that. So again, technology basically impeded even how fast we could get people here. But they changed over. They did telegraph ahead, though. The President did telegraph ahead and says, all right, I like that, Lieutenant Green, Major Russell, when you arrive, do not take any action until the Army officer that I'm sending to command the operation like that arrives. And like that, and this is the message they will receive when they arrived over here at Sandy Hook. They left by train. Finally, a special train was organized for Lee and Stewart, which was nothing more than an engine and a coal tender and like that, and they hot-footed it right behind the Marines heading for Harpers Ferry. By about 11:30 in the evening, like that, the Marines arrived here. Lee being, Green being a very good officer like that, followed orders to a point, but he did send people across to recon what was going on, to ascertain what the situation was. And again, it was one of those type of situations that it's never as good or it's ever as bad as reported. Once he realized, okay, we now have a stalemate situation like that, we have the insurrectionists bottled up, we have a large number of civilians, well over 2,000 people had amassed here at Harpers Ferry by that time, militias like that, and as Larry said, they were now basically, this was a standoff situation, the militia was ill prepared to have it, they were basically had been imbibing, the local citizenry like that were frustrated, they couldn't do anything, they were imbibing like that, and all of a sudden you've got a situation, not only do you have insurrectionists to deal with that are holding hostage, you've got 2,000 people that are drunk with firearms and a really bad attitude. So you can imagine like that is what was going through Lieutenant Colonel Lee's mind as he gets here. This could be a career-changing move, both good and bad, if I don't handle this right. So from that point on, the political decisions that were made were actually more important than the tactical decisions as how this whole thing would come about. He came across and like that by 1 o'clock in the morning he arrived, like I say, brought his Marine across, and it was pouring down rain at that point. It was a miserable day here at Harpers Ferry. Like it was dark, we couldn't see in the engine house what was going on. He crossed like I say, he crossed over the bridge, looked around, and the first thing he did is very quietly, seeing the condition of what's going on, is had his Marines come up and slowly relieve those militiamen that were inside the arsenal grounds surrounding the engine house, and had his professional Marines take over. Once that's done, he would then go to Lieutenant Green and says, okay, I do not know what's going to transpire at this point. This is still in the hands of the local militia. But I like that. I want you to formulate an assault plan. We are going to have to rescue these hostages. But again, political considerations are going to come in here as well. He couldn't take it on his own,
right?
Even though the president had given him, like I say, the capability of declaring martial law. Politically, that's the last thing he wanted to do. And like that, he wanted to basically work with the state of Virginia more than anything else. So he went, like I say, what Green says, in case, formulate a rescue situation, assault of the engine house. But if we do this and like that, we cannot afford, both for humanitarian reasons and for political reasons, any collateral damage. We cannot have friendly fire, or like say, we cannot kill any hostages. And why that becomes such a big issue politically, and like that, and even why would he even mention that? You look inside this engine house now. Can you tell who the good guy and who the bad guy is in there? The little adage we used to talk about in Vietnam is Marine. How do you tell a Viet Cong soldier from a South Vietnamese friendly? Well, the South Vietnamese friendly wears black pajamas. The Vietnamese soldiers wears black pajamas and carries an AK-47. Like I say, in the dark of the night, like that, on the night of the 17th into the 18th of 1859, you can imagine everybody in that house, both hostage and raider, wearing civilian clothes. It would be very, very difficult to determine who was friends or who was foe. So the decision was made that if the Marines did make the assault, they would go in with weapons unloaded. Only the bayonet would be used in the assault. Like that, and they would basically use that as a primary assault weapon. This was put in place, but at that point on, nothing more was done. It was too dark, and Lee wanted to wait like that until morning before anything was perpetuated. But while that was going on, as a good politician, he started to realize before he could take action, he was going to have to turn around and get permission from the local authority to do so. So he first went to the Maryland militia colonel, like that, and says, okay, you were some of the first militia on the scene, and like I'm sure you would like the honor of resolving this issue. And to paraphrase, we don't know exactly what it says, but to paraphrase what he said, and I said, oh no, like I got too many old married men and like that, and this is a Virginia here. We're just merely here to help. So they backed out. He then went to the colonel of the Virginia, the senior officer of the Virginia militia, said, sir, that's your friends, your neighbors in there, like they're being held hostage. It's your local citizens and your townspeople, your fellow Virginians that have been killed by these insurrections. Like I'm sure your militiamen would love the honor of resolving this situation. Well, you can imagine what might be going through the mind of that militia colonel. If he says, yeah, we'll do it, most of his militiamen are either suffering from hangovers or have been imbibing too much. And more importantly, as militiamen, they are not trained for this. The idea of domestic terrorism and hostage rescue was a new concept. And like you heard Larry talk about, literally there was only an unarmed night watchman even garnering this army. So how do you deal with this situation? And more importantly, it had to be going through his mind that yes, these are my friends and neighbors that are being held hostage in this engine house. They are also the same friends and neighbors that voted me into office as colonel. And if I basically make a decision and send my unprepared militiamen in to basically try to resolve this, and they fail, then who's going to get the blame? But on the other hand, some things never change throughout history. He figured if he turned it over to the Marines, and his comment was, you're the paid professionals, you're the paid mercenaries, you do it. That gave Lee the oath. And he was thinking about the idea, okay, if this happened, like that, if the Marines fail, then he can point the finger and says, all right, the federal government intervened. If they had kept their nose out, we could have resolved the issue. Finger pointing always happens after every incident. But on the other hand, if the Marines succeeded, as they would, now like that, being the senior colonel on the site, he could take the lion's share of the credit, which he essentially subsequently did after the raid. So this is the situation. At this point, this, like I say, the Marines have been briefed. They were starting to move up and ready. And like that, and Green would now move his assault force, which was made up of 12 men, bayonet fixed, and a backup relief force of 12 men, like to go in. The rest of the Marines are now surrounding the engine house and keeping both civilians at bay, as well as keeping the militiamen in. Once these, like say, Marines were in place like that, they were going to wait to daylight. Again, totally to collateral damage, not wanting to shoot the wrong people like that, not get anybody injured doing it. Lee was going to try one more time to basically try to do this bloodlessly. He wrote a note to the insurrectionists, like they gave it to Lieutenant Stewart. And Stewart was supposed to go to the door and talk to the leader of the insurrectionists, and had a letter in it saying, if you surrender unconditionally, the federal troops will do everything to guarantee their safety. Everything is primed now to happen. But everything we've talked about up to this point, the point of view of the Marines, the point of view of the citizens, the point of view of the militia, are pointing to the other side of the coin. These are the bad guys. But have we actually heard their point of view yet?
Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that the power of government derives from the people. That is, that the people give to their government whatever power it wields to serve and protect them. Mr. Jefferson continues, saying that whenever a government becomes abusive of that power, it is not only the right but the duty of the people to take back that power and either force the government to change its policies or give that power to a new government that is more amenable to their wishes and needs. Slavery, people held in bondage against their will, is a sin against God and all mankind. And any government that styles itself a democracy, that condones, supports, practices, finances, and encourages slavery is an abomination. It is abusing the power that its people have given to it. I brought my company into town yesterday in an attempt to seize back some of that power that we had given to our government and force them to change their policy on slavery. We are on a holy mission to remove the stain of the sin of slavery from the soul of our nation. But right away, things began going wrong. The townspeople put up more resistance than we expected. The militia mustered much more rapidly than we ever anticipated. And as they gathered, they began searching for the courage in the bottom of a bottle. They became drunk and rowdy. They began hunting down small groups of my men and slaughtering them in an orgy of bloodlust. Eventually, I and these few brave men with me, for all I know, all that's left of my original company of 21, were forced to take refuge in this firehouse. I sent two of my sons out to negotiate for food for the prisoners. They were shot down in the street like dogs. One died instantly and the other died in my arms several hours later. All night long we listened to the drunken revelry around us, watching for a chance to escape, but none ever came. Occasional outbursts of gunfire in the town gave us hope that possibly some of my men had rallied and were attempting a rescue. But that never happened. And last, the slaves never did rise up in support. Understandably, out of fear for what their masters might do to them if they were captured. Along about dawn, things became quiet. We began noticing that federal troops were relieving the militia that was surrounding us. United States federal troops. Where had they been that they could get here so quickly? But with them came a new hope. If we could be captured and arrested by federal troops, maybe they could protect us from the mob. And rather than being massacred and dragged through the streets in drunken revelry, they might protect us from the mob. We might be able to tell our story to the world and let the world decide on the merits of our motives. But if fate decided that we were to be killed at the hands of federal troops, at least it would be an honorable death, one fraught with meaning. Our blood would mingle with that of the millions who have died before us in bondage, and return in a great flood that would finally purge this guilty nation.
Very intense and very emotional speech. And all of a sudden, that clear black, clear white, good guy versus bad guy starts becoming blurred. Who's in the right here? Both sides are fighting for an ideal they believe in. Whether those decisions they make for that ideal are right or wrong, it'll only be up to you to decide. At this point, the sun was starting to come up in Harpers Ferry. The situation, one way or the other, needed to be resolved. Lee had gotten the clearance that he needed from the militia to assault these troops. The Marines were in place. Like that, literally as close as you see these Marines now, right off across the engine house. In reality, Brown could not see out, nor could these insurrectionists, other than one or two loopholes that had been cut in the bricks and maybe occasionally cracking the door open. The Marines could not see in. They didn't know what kind of weapons are going in, like that, where they would receive fire and such. But the assault had to go on. But Lee was going to try to avoid bloodshed one more time, as I said, and had written a note basically asking for the unconditional surrender of the insurrectionists. He told Lieutenant Stewart, "You'll deliver the note, but do not negotiate. It's either a clear yes or no." Stewart walks up, knocks on the door. So we believe John Brown himself opened the door, just slightly, pokes his carbine out. The note is passed on, and like that, Brown starts to negotiate. Stewart jumps up. Literally steps to this point in the engine house and a pre-requisite signal. Looks at Lieutenant Green, tips his hat. The first thing would happen, like say a sledgehammer team would be sent in like that to start beating on the door to try to break the door down. These sledgehammers were drawn from the armory. Now as they started to attack, they figured they would burst through the door. Shots were starting to ring out. Were they shooting the hostages? Were they shooting the Marines? All of a sudden, their own private named Luke Quinn would fall to the ground, wounded in the groin. He would eventually die. But unfortunately, physics would take place. Unknown to the Marines, the ropes of doors are roped on the inside. So the shock of the sledgehammer are being absorbed. They then had them down, the reserve force then would pick up a heavy fire ladder that happened to be laid outside the engine house and go to a more vulnerable point of the door. They would look at the hinges. That was a stable point. If they could strike that hard enough, they would actually break the door decision. Two strikes at the upper left-hand hinge of the door would break the door. It would pivot down, creating two triangular openings over the rope and on the lower hinge. At that point, as soon as the creative was open like that, the Marines would rush in. Lieutenant Green in the lead with his ceremonial sword, followed right behind by Mr. Russell, the staff officer, carrying a rattan switch. Now, what the heck he was going to do with that rattan switch, we're still not quite sure, but he wanted in the action. Right behind me up, Private Rupert, wounded in the jaw. The rest of them rushed in. As soon as Lieutenant Green got into the engine house, like that, he ran into Louis Washington, who immediately pointed out John Brown, who was kneeling on the ground in the process of reloading his breech carbine. Now, this is where the ceremonial sword comes in. Lieutenant Green raises back, slices down in John Brown, slices him in the arm and the neck. This is he would suffer through, like say, during the trial. But in a twist of fate, Green then drew back with his ceremonial sword and wanted to put a fatal thrust to the center of mass of John Brown. Unfortunately, something hit. Like I say, we don't know what it is. In an interview with Lieutenant Green in 1885, he said the sword struck something with resistance and bent. In fact, he even quoted that it bent completely in half. It must have been a very cheap ceremonial sword. Regardless, like that ceremonial sword has now saved John Brown's life. Meanwhile, like I see, Marines have rushed in. They bayoneted one raider underneath one of the fire engines. A second raider with two Marines with bayonet at the back of the engine house. The third raider would drop his weapon and actually try to blend into the hotches, save his life to get him being an assault Marine. Like I say, as soon as Green looked up, he saw, realized the situation was resolved, and he called a ceasefire, and John Brown was pulled out to the Marines before replying. Like that, an incident that would change us as an American society. You know how long it took? From the time Lieutenant Stewart tipped his hat to Lieutenant Green, to the time John Brown was physically brought out of the engine house, 3 minutes. 3 minutes that would change us as a society, because the political and social ramifications of what happened here in Harpers Ferry would change us. It would eventually, as was said earlier like that, this in many cases was the fuse that would lead us into civil war. Because Brown's action, because he did survive, and eventually the Marines would take charge of him like that and deliver him to the state authorities in Charlestown right down the road, he would be tried by the state government for murder and for servile insurrection, and like inciting servile insurrection, and eventually would get the death penalty for inciting servile insurrection. But not before, during the course of the trial, he was able to put his impassioned views forward the public. And what happened then, as now, how much information, depending on your point of view, the press gets involved. And they start, like I say, by having the Union point of view, the abolitionist point of view, and in the southern states, they're basically putting Brown as an insane man, and they're heralding him as a hero in the North. All of a sudden, society now is not looking in the middle. How do we resolve this? They are now becoming polarized. Sound familiar? Is our society going through that same type of polarization today? The same thing applies. Very relevant. For us as United States Marines, like that, we basically are dealing then, 158 years later, we're still doing the same thing. We're going from a joint services operation, dealing as an interdiction force, to a hostage rescue team, to an international police force. We were dealing with insurgents. We were dealing with indigenous populations that didn't necessarily want us there. We still got the job done. What this all leads to, and what I want you to walk away with, if you don't remember any other point, is what happened here was human beings all making decisions, for good or for bad, and what they believed in. How did that affect us? For us as Marines, these Marines 158 years ago, going all the way back to the American Revolution, we are who we are today because we stand on the shoulder of every generation of Marines that went before us. The same thing can be said for you as a society. We are who we are. Like that, it did not happen overnight. It was because of the sacrifices, the achievements, and the decisions that were made by us as a society, both good and bad throughout history, that was raised to bar and eventually what came out good? Yes, we went through 4 years of civil war after this, but ultimately we were one of the few nations in the world that came out after a civil war and became stronger, developing into society today. So the ultimate goal of our story here is this wasn't something old that happened 158 years ago. What this was our society growing and learning. And if we can learn from what happened then, learn from our mistakes in the past, hopefully we'll be less apt to create those mistakes in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you very much for your time. Now, if you would like I say, put the militiamen over here and our Marines, we'll have them stand down. I'm sure if you have any questions, they'd be happy to interact with you and answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Marines, order, arm. Rest.